part of the plan was not to just jump into this particular story in Mark 8, like we do many times with Bible studies or whatever. We jump into a story, we may get a lot out of it, but there's probably a lot more to get out of it, and we might even get the wrong things out of it because we don't understand the context. So the idea was to put the story in context. So last week we laid a lot of groundwork to get into the story tonight, so I just want to review the groundwork very quickly. Once David has got the thing up and running, if you want to hear more thoroughly the groundwork, you could always online and catch up with that a bit. So I'm going to move quickly through the groundwork that we laid last week and kind of break it down in like almost like bullet points. And the key for us, actually what I did was I typed out the bullet points, and I'm going to hang them up there in a minute, or have Aaron hang them up there so we can keep an eye on them. And when we actually get to the story, I'm hoping that we'll be able to see how all these things that Mark was writing leading into the story, he wasn't just like, oh yeah, and this happened, oh yeah, that happened. He's very conscious of what the Spirit of God was doing for days and weeks and months. And they're the same kinds of things you'll see that we can kind of easily lose track of as well. In Mark 6, 2 chapters earlier than the story that we're actually going to be in, it'll be familiar to you. It's when Jesus was at his hometown in Nazareth, and it says that he was rejected there. Based on the fact that he was rejected, it says Jesus couldn't do very much there because of their unbelief, which is kind of interesting in that he was rejected and it was called unbelief. But the thing for them in his hometown was they thought they knew who he was. Isn't this Joseph's kid? Basically was the response. And we might look at that and say, yeah, I know the feeling, it's kind of like a prophet in his own town is without honor, that kind of thing. But there's something more that's being said there, that it has to do with identity. In other words, as soon as we think that we've got Jesus sussed, oh yeah, I know about Jesus, and I know Jesus. As soon as we start to put those kinds of parameters on him, we're probably on the edge of unbelief, quite frankly. Because he's much more than what we think he is. He's always much more than we think he is, and we talked about this last week. The flip side of that, Jesus was very sure about his identity. He was very sure about it. He had a water baptism where the skies opened, and his identity was publicly known. This is my beloved Son. He knew who he was. So regardless of what anybody said around him, this is just Joseph's son, well, he knew otherwise. He had an assurance. He had that assurance tested, remember, by the devil in the wilderness. The devil says to him the first thing, if you are the Son of God, if you are, he's testing him, if you are the Son of God, I think you're just Joseph's son. It's that kind of thing for Jesus. Now, on the flip side, what I want to say is this. Everyone in here are sons of God. As soon as you start to see that as, well, it's just this, then you're probably not going to function as a son of God who can do amazing things. I'm not talking about miraculous things, but amazing things, and advancing the kingdom and all kinds of stuff. You see, there's something a lot being said about identity, and our identity with Christ. Jesus knew who he was, and he knew what that meant. So even when the if came along, well, if you're a son of God, he was still able to operate as a son of God. And I just want to challenge everybody in here, if you're still wondering about who you are in Christ, until we get over that hurdle right there and establish and understand sonship, it is very hard to move into anything else, quite frankly. We said last week, Herod is introduced very early on, and he's going to become important in our story. He's introduced as the one who beheads John the Baptist. He represents world systems that are always stifling, beheading the prophetic voice, if you would. But it's beyond that for Herod, because he was the king of Israel under Roman occupation, and he totally sold out to the Romans. In other words, instead of maintaining who he is as King Herod the Jew, he becomes a puppet for Rome. And there's a story in the Old Testament. Do you remember when Moses strikes the rock, and as a result of striking the rock, he's not allowed to go into the promised land? You may remember that story. Mm-hmm. And it may seem like, boy, that seems like such a petty thing to do, to be denied entrance into the promised land. But what was really behind it, when Moses strikes the rock, God says to him, you didn't hallow me before the people, which is a way of saying you did not represent me before the people. In other words, the people were miserable gits, quite frankly. And they were all over Moses. They were moaning, they were complaining, they were bad-mouthing God, bad-mouthing Moses, and they were getting right under Moses' skin. And it's like God says, you know what, people, yeah, they get under my skin too. But I don't act like them, I act like me. In other words, you got bitter like the bitter people around you, instead of making the bitter people around you better. You see, Herod, what he does is he gives himself over to the Romans, the world system, the world's way of doing things. Anybody in here ever been tempted? I know what the Bible says, and I know what I'm supposed to do, but this is the way the world does it. This is the way to get it done. It's a very, very slippery slope in there. Well, Herod slid right down. Moses slid right down. Moses, of all people. And that's why, striking the rock, God was saying point blank, you cannot lead these people. You've become like them instead of leading them into my presence like me. He says, you didn't believe me. Herod. As Jesus is feeding the 5,000, he says about the people that they're like sheep without a shepherd. He's identifying them as Israel. And he says, I have compassion on them. And compassion becomes a key word for everything we're going to look at from now on. During that story of the feeding of the 5,000, unless you've read it recently, you may not remember that the disciples, at the end of the first day, they say to Jesus, look, it's late in the day, they've been here all day long, it's been a long day, a great day, but it's been a long day, we're out in this place, it's a deserted place, send them away. Now for the disciples, that was a very compassionate thing to do. Send them away because there's no food out here. They can get food in the town. It sounds like a nice thing to do. Send them away. That's the disciples' compassion. But Jesus' question is this, and last week I think I must have asked it a dozen times in the time we spent together, how many loaves do you have? And he goes and he feeds the 5,000. As the story moves on, he ends up walking on water, you remember, when they're out in the middle of the Sea of Galilee. And it says the wind was contrary to them. So he walks on the water out to them, and he gives them, he says, 3 different things that are crucial for all of us. He says, be of good cheer. Okay, of good cheer, whatever. Be. It's very important. Be is what he says to us. Be of good cheer. I am. Be not afraid. So he gives us a be, I am, and a be not. It becomes very clear. Be what you are, I am, don't be what you're not. It's a pretty simple kind of outline. It could get very deep, but it's pretty simple. By the time the sea calms down to get to the other side, it says that in Mark, he says that they were afraid out there in the boat when they saw him walking on the water, because they had not understood the loaves. Now, I'm not sure what there is to understand about it, quite frankly. You got nothing, it seems like, and then you're feeding 5,000 people. I'm not sure exactly the depth of understanding you need to have, but that's what Mark says, and that's he's leading us along here. We had not understood about the loaves because our hearts were hard. Now remember, the Word is written in our hearts. In the Old Testament, the Word is written on stone. A hard heart is like a heart that is still being given over to the law, to the stone, to the 10 Commandments, that kind of thing, to all that was written on stone. When Christ comes into our heart, he softens it up. It's the same Word, but now it's on a fleshly heart. It's a nice way of Mark saying we still weren't getting it. Our hearts were still not in the right place. He was talking and we were listening to him. He was doing things and we were watching, but we just weren't getting it. These things are all rolling into the story. It's not in Mark, but it's over in John. When they get to the other side is where Jesus spends like 60 verses describing and repeating over and over again, I am the bread of life. And we said last week, and this is really important, Jesus just didn't say, he said, I am the bread of life, and he fed thousands of people. He did a teaching and then he lived it. They were never like separated. He wasn't just a Bible teacher or stands up in a pulpit and says something and then doesn't live it, doesn't act it out. It's always lining up. His teaching, the Word becomes flesh. The Word gets fleshed out. He speaks, the Word comes out, and then it's fleshed out in his life. If you're not sure what he said, watch what he does. That's what he says at the Last Supper. If you're not getting the Word, at least believe me for the work's sake. Can you see the truth in the works themselves? Surely you can. And the disciples say, don't call me Shirley. Yeah, I know. I was waiting for that one day. All of a sudden the Pharisees show up, and it says they come from Jerusalem. These guys, the writers of the Gospels, pick their words. They're not just throwing stuff. When they say they came from Jerusalem. This is their life. This is where they live. They live in Jerusalem, in the temple, with the robes, walking through the streets, all the accolades, all the religious spirits on both shoulders, under the robes, on it. I mean, the place is just, it's a mess with religious nonsense, quite frankly. They came from Jerusalem, and they show up, and they're taking issue with Jesus' disciples because they don't wash their hands before eating bread. So we're still on the bread kick. We're feeding 5,000 people with bread. We come along, and we've got the issue of bread again. Jesus saying he's the bread of life, the defilement, this whole thing is taking place. Jesus does a teaching on defilement. Is not something that happens to you by what you put into your body, but what comes out of your mouth, because that comes out of your heart. It's not what goes into a man that defiles him, it's what comes out. Now this kind of thing is absolutely annihilating the Pharisees because they're teaching them the opposite. Excuse me, no, it's what goes into your mouth that defiles you. We're Jewish, remember? We have a very, very strict dietary code. And Jesus is saying hogwash. It's meaningless. Absolutely meaningless. There's no spiritual significance to what you eat or don't eat. The spiritual significance is what's going on in your heart. Jesus is constantly transitioning. These Pharisees are into the external. They're into everything that's going on around them externally. And Jesus is working on the internal. He's working on the inside, on the heart. Mark says our hearts were hard. That's why we're not getting this stuff right. We saw it externally. We experienced it time and time again. What I'm not reading here in my notes is that all over the place, every other verse, Jesus is doing healings and miracles and wonders and this. He's all over the place with a demonstration of the kingdom like this world has never seen. But they weren't getting it because their hearts weren't right, is what Mark says. And then all of a sudden we have the Syrophoenician woman show up. She's a Greek. And it becomes a very interesting situation with her because she's begging Jesus for her daughter's sake. The disciples, their comment is, send her away. Same thing they said with the feeding of the 5,000. Now it's with this Gentile woman, but for a different reason. The feeding of the 5,000, it looks like an act of compassion. Send them away, they're hungry, they got to eat. With this woman, it's no act of compassion. They're basically saying, she's a Gentile. What are you going to do with her? Send her away, get rid of her. She's a pain in the neck. She keeps screaming and yelling for you to do something. We know that you're only sent to the sheep of Israel. They could have been 12 Pharisees lining up saying that. It says in the passage, Jesus sat there for a while, didn't say a word. He can hear his disciples saying, send her away. He sees this woman, not a Gentile. He sees this woman, a real person with a real daughter who's suffering and being tossed around by a demon. Well, she's not a Christian. A lot of Christians think that way. Well, they're not Christians. Dun, 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 dun. Jesus doesn't think like that at all. He's looking at a woman who's suffering. And then he says the thing that bothers all of us. I've never met a Christian yet that didn't bother until you see what's happening. When he says to her, am I supposed to take bread from the children's mouth and give it to the dogs? And that's always bothered people, unless you're looking at the situation. If I just threw that line at you that there was a man who saw a Gentile woman begging and stood over her and said, am I supposed to take bread from the children of Israel and give it to a Gentile dog? Does that sound like a particular class of person that would say that? It sounds like a Pharisee, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. It's a down-the-line Pharisaical statement. Besides being a Pharisaical statement, his disciples are the ones that have just said, send her away. And that's basically what he's doing. He's sitting there, sending her away. And it's an obnoxious, disgusting statement and picture to this woman. Correct me if I'm wrong, I'm open to correction. It's a nasty thing to say, because that's exactly what the disciples were saying was something, send her away. And when you look at this whole situation, she ends up appealing to Jesus and saying, but even dogs are entitled to the crumbs that come off of their master's table. And Jesus commends her for having great faith. You see, she's on her knees, it says, at the feet of Jesus. She has the faith. She has great faith. She has the faith the disciples should have had. Let me put it this way. She's at his feet thinking, I know he's a Jew. I know he's ministering to the Jews. I think he's more than a Jewish Messiah. I think he's more than a Jewish prophet. I think he cares for all of humanity. I think he wants to save the entire world. I think he really believes that God so loved the world. He didn't classify them by race, color, creed, or anything else. He loves the world. He loves every single person in the world, and I'm putting all my chips on that. I bet that if I appeal to him, he will respond and heal my daughter, because he doesn't see neither Jew nor Greek. He doesn't see male nor female. He doesn't see rich, poor. He doesn't see mama, papa. He doesn't see any of that. He sees someone in need, appealing to him and asking and believing in him as more than the Son of David, quite frankly. Son of David, have mercy on me. Yeah, that's fine for the Jews. I'm appealing to something even more than that. You can operate at that level if you want. I'm going higher. You think he's only Joseph's kid? I'm going higher. I'm going to a higher source. And I believe that. I've got faith for that. And Jesus says, this woman's got great faith. She has woo! She's gone way out there someplace now. While the disciples are still looking and saying, she's a Gentile dog. That's what the picture is going on here. She's got great faith. The disciples have very little faith. Why? Because they believe in a very little God. They believe in a little Jewish God. She's got great faith. Why? She believes in a great God. She's not going through religion. She's not going through anything. She's going straight to Jesus. He's the man. That's the man right there. He does it all.
Why did he say that to her, though? Did he do that to set up the disciples?
I believe that he said it totally to show the Pharisees and the disciples exactly what they are like. I think that the disciples sat there smiling going, yeah, there you go, that's right. And the Pharisees, well, maybe he is one of us. And Jesus is light years ahead of them. Because see, when he sees her, he sees great faith. He already sees it. Before she goes any further, he sees it. He knows great faith when he sees it.
Just tying in with what you said, it's just almost like he was giving the parallel that they were thinking along the same lines as the Pharisees, that they were locked into that they were, even though they were his disciples, they were Pharisees though, on his side. It's just the way the Pharisees, the Jewish Pharisees, were over on their side, looking at everything. They actually, because they were the disciples, they actually were the Pharisees as well.
You hold on to these things that we're saying, because this is all the stuff that's leading into this story. And when you retain all these things we're talking about, the identification, the rejection, he has compassion. Their view of compassion is send someone away. He asks, how many loaves do you have? They don't get it. They don't understand because of the condition of their hearts. The Pharisees come questioning the disciples because they're defiling themselves. Jesus is still talking about defilement doesn't go into the mouth, it comes out of the heart. He identifies himself as I am the bread of life. We've got all this happening that's leading into the story. We have the great faith of the Syrophoenician woman. She's commended for her great faith. We go on to feed the 4,000, which are Gentiles, by the way. A lot of people don't realize this. But as you follow Jesus' steps, he's moving further and further out of Israel into Gentile territory. So the feeding of the 4,000 is not 4,000 Jews. The feeding of the 4,000 is 4,000 Gentiles. Now, what makes it real interesting, the feeding of the 5,000, remember the disciples, after one day, the end of one day, at the end of one day, Jesus, send them all into town. Let them get some food. They must be starving. It's been a long day. The feeding of the 4,000, after 3 days, not a peep from the disciples, not a peep. After 3 days. After one day, 5,000 Jews. Why don't you send them into town so they can eat? After 3 days, 4,000 Gentiles. Oh, hey, pass me a piece of fish, would you? Yeah. After 3 days, Jesus says, it's been 3 days they've been out here with me. You got to wonder, how many days would it have taken before one disciple would stand up and say, not for anything, it's been 4 or 5 days now, these people haven't eaten. Why don't they say anything? Because they're doing exactly what a lot of people today do. Well, there are 4,000 Muslims. Not my problem. They got their own God. But that's just not the way Jesus sees it. That's the whole thing. Jesus just sees something that we're not seeing. Jesus says, I have compassion. I got to tell you something about compassion. It never looks at color, age, gender, nothing. It sees nothing. It's compassion. It's moved. I'm moved by it for everybody. how many loaves do you have? They've got all kinds of reasons why this thing ain't ever going to fly. And it's amazing to me, after walking on water, feeding 5,000 people, doing all these miracles and everything else, it's kind of an amazing thing that's unfolding. And then the Pharisees show up again, and this time it's just blatantly they're testing him about signs. I'm sure you remember the conversation that Jesus has with Nick at night in John chapter 3 about heavenly and earthly things. It's like, I've been talking to you about earthly things, and you're not able to get a hold of that. How am I going to talk to you about heavenly things? And he's looking at these Pharisees. Remember, Nicodemus was a Pharisee. And saying, you know, you're asking me for a sign from heaven, and there's signs all around you on earth. Now, what's more important that's being said, and then we'll read the story. There's something very important. I know you know this, but you may not have thought about it this way. In the Old Testament, the Pharisees, their view of the Old Testament and of God is one where God interrupts the affairs of men. He interrupts. These Pharisees are asking for a sign from heaven. You know, if you're really who you say you are, then you should be able to bring a divine interruption. Jesus is trying to teach people around him. And it's very, very hard if you have an idea of God that he visits us occasionally. If you're into visitation, you're missing God. I've got to be honest with you.